Hey guys. Tonight we begin in the shadows of Victorian London, where old Nichol Street sits like a forgotten bruise on the city. You step into a world where boots sink into mud that never fully dries, where familiar sounds turn strange in the narrow dark, and where survival feels like a daily negotiation. It is a place polite society pretends not to see, but you are about to walk straight through its heart. So before you get too cozy, take a second to gently tap that new hype button YouTube just added. It really does help little guys like me push through the algorithm. And be sure to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of quiet storytelling. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is drifting off with us around the world. Now, get comfortable, let the day melt away, and we'll drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. You slip into Old Nichol Street the way someone slips into cold bathwater, slowly at first, then with the sinking realization that it is far too late to turn back. The air greets you with a mixture of soot, cooking smoke, and an aroma you optimistically label as mystery. The street is narrow enough that you feel the buildings leaning in, as if curious to see who wandered in by accident. They tilt in that tired Victorian way, like they have spent too many years holding themselves together out of sheer stubbornness and are now reconsidering the entire arrangement. People move around you in a current you cannot quite predict. Everyone has somewhere to be, even if that somewhere is simply anywhere that is not the place they just left. You feel the ground soften under your boots, a blend of mud, ash, and the collective efforts of countless feet. There is a rhythm here, a pulsing energy built from voices calling out, carts rattling past, and someone slamming a door that has clearly had enough of being part of the furniture. A boy darts by with a loaf of bread tucked under his coat, and 3 adults shout after him. None of them the baker who actually lost the loaf. A woman nearby shakes her head with a sigh that suggests this is the 50th such incident she has seen today, and it is still morning. You try to step out of the way, but stepping out of the way is not an option on Old Nichol Street. You are part of the flow now, whether you signed up for it or not. The smell intensifies as you walk, and you sneak a glance at the source. A pot boils on a doorstep, the contents bubbling with an enthusiasm that makes you hope it is soup, but suspect it is something that has never once been called soup in polite company. Someone ladles out a portion and hands it to a passing man, who thanks her with the weary relief of one who measures life in small mercies. You wonder if you should try some, but you do value the continued functionality of your internal organs. You catch snippets of conversation as you go, sharp and quick, layered with sarcasm that could cut through cobblestone. Everyone seems to know everyone, and everyone seems mildly annoyed with everyone, though with the affectionate annoyance of a family that never got the memo about personal space. You step around a pair of neighbors enthusiastically arguing over something that might involve laundry or might involve betrayal, and truly, either option feels feasible here. The buildings sag with age, patched and repatched, boards nailed over boards in a kind of architectural shrug. Laundry hangs between windows, fluttering in the faint breeze like flags of domestic surrender. You hear a cough echo from an upper room, loud enough to suggest the illness itself is trying to make its presence known. A cat watches you from a ledge, eyes half closed, judging your life choices with remarkable efficiency. You realize the city beyond this street has no idea what happens here, or, worse, it knows and prefers not to think about it. Old Nichol Street exists like a secret the city keeps but never acknowledges, tucked away where it can pretend the problem is distance rather than indifference. Yet here you are, standing in the middle of it, feeling the weight of a world crowded into a single narrow lane. As you move farther in, the noise settles into a kind of rough harmony. It is chaotic, yes, but it is also alive, stubbornly so. The street hums with stories, some whispered, some shouted, all tangled together in a place the world chose to overlook. And you keep walking, drawn in despite yourself, wondering what waits around the next tight corner. You slip deeper into the alleys branching from Old Nichol Street, each one narrowing until you feel the walls press in on your shoulders. The ground beneath you shifts from uneven cobblestone to something that could be mud, could be ash, or could be whatever the street decided to ferment today. The alleys twist without warning, doubling back on themselves like they were designed by someone who spent too much time drinking and not enough time thinking about navigation. You take a turn you think is sensible, only to discover that sensible has no jurisdiction here. Every corner feels like it hides a secret, usually in the form of a cat, a suspicious puddle, or a person who materializes behind you with startling ease. Residents glide through the maze with the confidence of people who learned these paths the same way others learn to walk. You watch a girl of no more than 8 years dart through 3 turns in quick succession, vanish behind a hanging sheet, reappear on the other side of a fence you did not notice existed, and give you a look that says she knows you will never be able to replicate that maneuver, even if given a map and divine guidance. You start to understand that the alleys are not random. They are deliberate, shaped by years of need, fear, and the collective creativity of people, determined to make themselves difficult to reach. The passageways narrow at the exact spots where you would want more room. The blind corners appear in places where a stranger might feel comfortable, but a resident would know better. You turn into a small courtyard where a group of women scrub laundry in basins, chatting with the kind of cheerful bluntness that makes you feel both welcomed and mildly warned. One of them glances at you and points out an exit that you swear did not exist before she gestured to it. The farther you go, the more the layout feels like a living thing. You sense how it protects those who call it home, sheltering them from prying eyes, unwelcome authority, and anyone who thinks a straight line is a normal way to organize space. The alleys bend around tiny gardens that somehow survive despite getting exactly 0 direct sunlight. They snake past doorways where families gather on stoops, sharing news in hushed tones while pretending not to watch you walk by. A man lounges against a wall, arms crossed, his expression amused in that way people get when watching a novice attempt something everyone else finds obvious. But the maze has its traps too. You step into a passage so narrow your shoulders brush both sides, then follow it until it dissolves into a dead end decorated with someone's laundry and a very territorial goose. You back away slowly, because this goose looks like it has seen things. When you try another route, you find yourself emerging into the same cramped court you passed 10 minutes ago, greeted by the same women who laugh in a way that is not unkind, merely inevitable. You finally realize the alleys are sorting you, testing you, deciding whether you are passing through or truly paying attention. The residents slip around you like water, moving as though the maze parts for them. You move like someone trying to solve a riddle that keeps rewriting its clues. Yet as you trace another winding turn, you feel something shift, a subtle sense that the slum is no longer treating you as a lost wanderer, but as someone willing to learn its rules. And so you keep walking, letting the maze guide you, aware that every twist reveals a little more of the strange logic holding this hidden world together. The noise reaches you before the people do, rising and falling like an argument between brass instruments. You turn onto a wider stretch of the slum and find yourself dropped straight into a street market that looks like it was assembled overnight by individuals who have never once agreed on anything except the need to yell loudly. Sellers line both sides of the lane, each armed with a basket, a crate, or what appears to be an upturned drawer repurposed into a display table. They shout prices with the kind of energy usually reserved for life or death situations, which, to be fair, might not be far from the truth here. You try to make sense of it. One man bellows about turnips, insisting with great passion that his vegetables are fresher than the ones offered by the woman 3 feet away, who responds by holding up a turnip like a weapon and loudly questioning his eyesight. Another seller waves a tray of fish so close to your face that you momentarily reconsider your relationship with seafood. The fish glisten with a sheen that might be moisture or might be something else entirely. And the man promises you will not find a better bargain anywhere in London, mostly because no one else would dare call these particular fish a bargain. A woman balancing a pile of faded ribbons on her head marches toward you with purpose. She declares that you desperately need new adornment, even though your expression clearly reads as someone who barely knows what day it is, much less what counts as fashion in this part of the city. She thrusts a ribbon at you, demanding a price you pretend not to hear, and then immediately lowers it when she realizes she is competing with a child selling buttons from a tin can. The child jingles the can at you with professional determination, proving that age has no bearing on entrepreneurial ferocity in Old Nichol Street. Every few steps, someone else shouts an offer with the kind of desperation that could shake loose coins out of stone. A man with a crate of boots insists they are almost new, though the leather looks like it remembers every year of the century. A woman sells apples that appear to have survived several rounds of conflict, but still carries herself with the confidence of someone who knows scarcity is on her side. Another vendor offers what he calls medicine, stored in small bottles with labels that have given up their will to exist. You politely decline, because the last thing you need is to drink something that smells like bad decisions and damp wood. The crowd flows around you as the sellers attempt to outshout one another, creating a layered chorus of hope, frustration, and unapologetic hustle. You notice the rhythm beneath the noise, a kind of desperate melody held together by the sheer force of people who cannot afford silence. Voices blend, overlap, clash, and somehow form a harmony that feels unique to this street alone. It is chaotic and relentless, yet strangely impressive in its commitment. You move through the market and see how quickly a seller's expression shifts the moment someone stops to look. Eyes sharpen, posture straightens, and the shouting pivots from general noise to targeted encouragement. For a brief moment, the world shrinks to a single exchange, a hope that this sale, this small moment, might stretch the day a little farther. And as you weave deeper into the crowd, you begin to understand that this uproar is not just commerce, it is survival set to a soundtrack. You follow a narrow passage into a quieter corner of the slum where a row of tall, leaning buildings stands shoulder to shoulder as if holding each other up out of mutual exhaustion. A wooden sign hangs above one door, creaking faintly in the breeze. It announces a lodging house, though the lettering looks like it gave up halfway through the word lodging and decided close enough was good enough. People slip in and out with the resigned efficiency of commuters entering a train station, except instead of trains, there are cramped rooms, and instead of schedules, there is the simple rule of first come, first horizontal. You step inside and immediately feel the temperature rise. The air is thick and warm, packed with the smell of bodies, soap that tried its best, and stew from an earlier hour that refuses to fully depart. A narrow staircase crawls upward like a reluctant spine, and every step creaks under your weight, threatening to lodge a complaint with the building's management. You suspect the management is also creaking somewhere nearby. A man showing you around moves quickly, which is admirable given the impossibly tight space. He gestures at a door barely wide enough to qualify as a door and assures you there is plenty of room. You duck your head and peek inside. The room contains 3 beds, if the word bed can be stretched to include sacks of straw with thin blankets on top. The occupants lie shoulder to shoulder, toes nearly touching the opposite wall, a layout that resembles a human version of library shelving. Not one person seems bothered by this arrangement. In fact, they barely glance up as you linger in the doorway, perhaps because conserving energy is more valuable than acknowledging newcomers. You climb another flight, passing a woman carrying what looks like a wash basin and the posture of someone who has accepted the futility of washing anything in this building. She nods and squeezes past you with the grace of someone who has done this more times than she can count. On the next floor, a room holds 2 families living in a space designed for one person who does not mind bumping into furniture. Children sleep in corners, under tables, on pallets tucked wherever the walls leave a disputed, small gap. Someone has hung a curtain to divide the room, though the curtain is made from stitched-together scraps that do absolutely nothing except make everyone feel marginally better. The guide tells you proudly that the top floor has the best ventilation, which makes sense until you reach it and realize that by ventilation he means the roof is missing a few tiles. A chilly draft rolls through the room like a bored house guest, but the dozen residents seem to appreciate the air far more than they mind the weather. A man smoking a pipe sits near the largest gap in the roof, claiming that this is the premium spot because it offers a view of the sky. You look up and see a patch of gray that could be clouds or could be the general mood of London. Despite the crowding, despite the noise, despite the fact that every room feels like it was filled by someone pouring people in through a funnel, you sense something else here too. The residents know each other. They share blankets, bread, stories, and whatever scraps of humor they can gather. It is cramped and chaotic, but it is also a kind of community assembled out of necessity and grit. You leave the building and step back into the street, the walls loosening their grip as fresh air finds you again. And as you look back at the leaning structure, you realize it is not the size of the space that defines these rooms, but the number of lives pressed together inside them. Night settles over Old Nichol Street with the subtlety of a falling anvil. One moment, the sky is dim. The next, the entire slum slips into a darkness so complete you start questioning whether the lamps ever worked or if they were simply decorative lies. You find yourself tucked into a narrow lodging room, the walls so thin you feel as if someone simply painted them on for the sake of appearances. The air grows cooler, heavier, and the sounds begin to rise, one by one, like performers in a very questionable nighttime orchestra. You lie still and listen. At first it is only the usual shuffle of footsteps on the landing, but even those sound different in the dark. They drag a little slower, linger a moment longer outside each door, as if deciding which life is most interesting to eavesdrop on. A cough rattles from the room beside yours, the kind of cough that sounds like it has been practicing for years. It echoes through the wall, and you imagine the dust between the boards trembling with each raspy exhale. Somewhere beneath you, two men begin an argument. You cannot make out the words, but the tone is clear enough. The deep, growling frustration of people who have run out of patience, but not out of energy. Their voices rise, fall, then rise again, as if one of them suddenly remembered a point he forgot to be angry about earlier. A baby cries from another room, a soft wail that climbs in pitch until it settles into a steady rhythm. No one goes to soothe it immediately, not because they do not care, but because in a place this full, sounds overlap so often that people learn to wait a few moments before reacting. Then comes the scraping noise. It drags across the floorboards above you, slow and deliberate, like furniture being moved or someone with very heavy shoes changing their mind repeatedly about where to stand. You hold your breath, listening to it pause, shift, and scrape again. It is not threatening exactly, but it is certainly not comforting. You try to imagine an innocent explanation, but every possibility feels worse than the last. Eventually, the scraping stops, replaced by footsteps heading toward the stairs, with the ponderous weight of someone who has lived through too many difficult choices. A sudden shout breaks the quiet, sharp enough to make your pulse jump. It is followed by the unmistakable slam of a door, then a flurry of hurried whispers. You cannot tell if the whispers are friendly, panicked, or just nosy. In Old Nichol Street, those categories often overlap. From outside the building comes a faint clatter of hooves on cobblestone, quickly swallowed by laughter and someone singing off-key. The song wanders in and out of tune until it fades into the night, like a drunk ghost losing interest. You shift on the narrow bed and hear another sound, a soft tap against the window. You freeze. There is a second tap, and then the faintest scurry, as if something small and nimble has decided to investigate your presence. You do not look, mostly because you do not want to know what finds your window worth tapping on at this hour. It moves away eventually, leaving you alone again with the layered noises of a building that never really sleeps. Lying there, you begin to understand why the residents navigate the night with such practiced calm. Every sound feels like a warning, yet none of them necessarily are. Here, nighttime is not quiet. It is simply another version of the day, stripped of sunlight and pretenses, leaving only the raw pulse of lives packed too close together. And, as you listen to the strange symphony swirl around you, you realize you are hearing the slum breathe. You follow a boy up a narrow stairwell that groans under every step, as if the building itself would prefer you turn around and pretend you never found your way here. He leads you to a door swollen from years of damp, which he pushes open with a practiced shove of his shoulder. The room beyond is dim, warmed only by the faint glow of a single lamp and the collective body heat of too many people in too little space. The air carries the scent of wet wood, boiled vegetables, and the lingering chill that never quite leaves these walls no matter how many fires are lit. A woman greets you with a tired smile that somehow still feels genuine. She gestures you inside, as if she has all the space in the world to spare. She does not, of course. But hospitality here seems to operate independently of physics. 3 children sit on a pallet pushed against the far wall, their legs tucked under a blanket that has clearly been mended more times than it has been washed. They eye you with curiosity, heads tilted, trying to decide if you are interesting or simply interrupting their evening routine. The father sits near the stove, stirring a pot of something that looks thin yet smells better than you expect. He nods at you, the kind of nod men reserve for situations where they are too tired to speak but still understand the importance of manners. The stove crackles half-heartedly, fighting a losing battle against the moisture that creeps in through every crack. You can see where the walls have bloomed with patches of mold that resemble maps of continents no one wants to discover. The room is barely large enough for the family, yet somehow it contains everything they need. A table whose legs have been reinforced with mismatched pieces of scrap wood, a few chipped cups lined up proudly on a shelf, a bundle of clothes drying near the fire, and a cradle tucked into a corner you did not notice at first. Inside it, a baby sleeps with the deep, unaltered peace of someone too young to understand anything about the world it has been born into. The children warm to you quickly. One of them offers you a piece of bread so small you hesitate to take it. But refusing feels worse. You accept it, breaking off an even smaller piece for yourself because the child watches with the seriousness of a banker monitoring a transaction. The mother laughs softly, a sound that smooths the sharp edges of the room for a moment. She tells you how long they have lived here, how many times the roof has leaked, how often the landlord promises improvement and delivers nothing except a reminder of the rent due. Her voice carries both strength and exhaustion, intertwined like the threads in the patched blankets. She speaks without bitterness, only practicality. There is no point in anger when anger cannot patch the holes in the ceiling. Yet beneath her calm, you sense something else, a stubborn thread of determination that refuses to fray no matter how many storms shake the building. The father ladles stew into bowls and hands them to the children first, each portion carefully measured with a precision that comes from living on the edge of not enough. When he finally serves himself, it is barely a spoonful. You notice the mother has given herself even less. They do it wordlessly, a ritual performed so often they no longer need to acknowledge the sacrifice. You sit with them as they eat, listening to the gentle chatter of the children, the soft rattle of wind slipping through the window frame, the quiet rhythm of a family making do with what the world has allowed them. It is cramped, cold, and worn down by constant struggle. Yet there is a warmth here that the room itself cannot provide. You leave with the sense that resilience in Old Nichol Street is not loud or defiant. It is quiet, persistent, and carefully folded into every small act of survival. You set out behind a knot of dumb children who have decided, without discussion, that you may follow them as long as you do not ask too many questions or walk like someone afraid of puddles. They move with a confidence that borders on supernatural, slipping through gaps between crates, skirting piles of rubbish, and ducking under laundry lines with the precision of people who learned these streets the same way others learn nursery rhymes. One of the older boys glances back at you with a grin that suggests he is taking quiet bets on how long it will take you to fall behind. They lead you through a crooked passage where the walls lean sharply inward, and you find yourself tilting sideways just to fit through. The children slide through it as effortlessly as water. They hop over a broken step without even looking down, while you approach the same step like it is a complex moral decision. The smallest girl sees your hesitation and, in a display of generosity, announces that she will show you which boards creak loudly, enough to wake the entire street. She taps them one by one with the authority of a seasoned cartographer, revealing the dangerous parts of the map. You watch as they gather near a row of crates that serve as makeshift seats. They speak to each other in quick bursts, tossing jokes and observations with the speed of kids who have learned that humor costs nothing and is the only form of entertainment the slum provides for free. They point out shortcuts that look impossible until one of them demonstrates by slipping through a gap between two buildings that seems too narrow for human bones. When you peer into the space, the boy has already popped out on the other side, waving at you like a triumphant magician. The children know which alleys to avoid because the ground gets slick there after sunset. They know which windows belong to people who tolerate noise and which ones conceal someone with a broom and very strong opinions. They count chimney plumes like weather signs, declare that a thicker smoke means stew night, and absolutely sprint toward the scent of anything sweet. Even if the sweetness turns out to be wishful thinking, they maneuver around adults the way fish move around rocks, unbothered by obstacles that send you stumbling. A girl no taller than your waist walks ahead with her chin lifted, describing how she and her friends play a game where they race from one end of the slum to the other without touching the ground. You assume she is exaggerating until she hops up onto a series of crates, barrels, and bricks with acrobatic enthusiasm. She reaches the far end before you even decide which crate looks sturdy enough to trust with your entire weight. When she lands back on the cobblestone, she looks at you with a mixture of pride and pity, both of which are equally deserved. As you follow them deeper into the tangle of streets, you begin to see how growing up here shapes a person. Their eyes are quick, always searching. Their feet know the safest paths without needing to look down. They recognize danger long before you do and treat it with a kind of casual familiarity, not because they are fearless, but because fear wastes time. They shout warnings to each other, point out loose shutters, laugh when someone misjudges a jump, and move on with a momentum that feels unstoppable. You realize that their survival skills are not taught in lessons. They are absorbed from the air, inherited from the rhythm of the slum itself. These children navigate Old Nichol Street not as victims of it, but as its most adaptable inhabitants. They dart ahead again, disappearing around a bend you would have never noticed, and instinctively you follow, hoping to learn just a fraction of what they seem to know without trying. You start the morning thinking you understand what scarcity looks like, but Old Nichol Street corrects you before the day has even warmed. The first thing you notice is a woman crouched beside a refuse heap, picking through it with the calm precision of someone browsing a shop window. She lifts a bruised apple, turns it over, and gently cuts away the worst parts with a knife so small it looks more symbolic than functional. She wraps the salvageable pieces in a cloth and pockets them with a sigh that sounds both weary and relieved. It strikes you how natural the action feels here, as common as someone checking a clock. A man nearby haggles over a pile of bones with a butcher whose stall consists of a table, a cleaver, and a shrug. The bones have almost no meat left on them, but the man runs his fingers along each one like he is selecting jewels. He chooses two and tucks them under his arm, explaining to no one in particular that they will flavor a stew nicely if boiled long enough. You nod out of instinct, even though you cannot imagine what stew emerges from such meager beginnings. Then again, imagination is a luxury this place does not have time for. You wander farther and find a mother measuring out food with military discipline. She breaks a loaf into portions so small, you wonder if anyone could feel full from them. Yet she arranges each piece with care, making sure the children eat first. They chew slowly, stretching every bite, while she eats only when their attention drifts elsewhere. It is a ritual you have already seen in several homes, carried out with the quiet understanding that hunger is a household guest who must be managed carefully. Rest is treated the same way. People do not nap so much as negotiate tiny truces with exhaustion. A man lies on a stoop with his eyes half closed, only to sit upright at the faintest sound of footsteps. A woman leans against a wall for a moment, her head drooping, before she forces herself awake and resumes walking. Children collapse into sleep whenever they can find a soft enough surface, drifting off with the uncanny ability to ignore the noise around them. You see a boy curled up beside a doorway, his face smudged, his breathing steady. He sleeps, with the serenity of someone who has learned to seize rest the moment it becomes available, because it may not come again for hours. Work, if it can be called that, flows nonstop. A girl gathers firewood scraps, carrying them in bundles almost as large as she is. A man sharpens knives for a few pennies, each stroke of the blade an act of grim patience. Laundry stretches across alleys, dripping water that falls rhythmically onto the heads of anyone careless enough to walk beneath it. Every action seems calculated, every moment weighed against what it might cost or provide. What surprises you most is how people fold slivers of comfort into these choices with an almost artistic determination. A woman hums softly as she mends a rip in her dress, turning frayed fabric into something presentable. An older man sits on a crate, carving a tiny wooden toy, his hands steady even though the toy will likely be given away before he finishes it. These gestures are small, but they feel rebellious in a way, as if they are tiny proclamations that survival does not mean surrendering every scrap of joy. As you watch the rhythm of the street, you understand that poverty here is not just a condition, it is a force that shapes decisions with quiet authority, guiding hands, feet, and thoughts with persistent pressure. People bend under it without breaking, adjusting, innovating, and pushing forward one careful step at a time. You realize that in old Nichol Street, every choice is a negotiation, every moment a calculation, and every victory, no matter how small, carries the weight of triumph. You notice the women first by the way they move, not loudly or grandly, but with the steady determination of people who understand that stopping, even for a moment, would cause the entire household to collapse, like a poorly stacked tower of crates. They weave through the alleys carrying baskets, cloths, babies, firewood, and occasionally a husband who has fallen asleep in an inconvenient location. They do all of this while holding conversations, shooing children away from danger, and convincing stubborn pots to boil faster through sheer willpower. One woman stands outside her doorway, wringing out laundry into a basin that has clearly seen more centuries than it was designed for. She chats with a neighbor, her voice warm and firm, while her hands work automatically. A child tugs at her skirt, asking something urgent about a missing toy. Without missing a beat, she points to the roof and reminds the child that he threw it up there in a fit of heroic imagination. The boy nods solemnly, as if he has just been reminded of a grave personal commitment, and runs off to retrieve it through means you choose not to investigate. Inside another room, you find a woman kneading dough on a table that tilts slightly to one side. She adjusts her weight without thinking, pushing the dough rhythmically as she explains that baking is easier when done in the morning because the heat later in the day turns the room into a sauna with a personality. Her children dart around her like restless sparrows, and she keeps track of every one of them, even as she kneads, shapes, and sets aside the bread. You suspect she would also be capable of solving complex mathematical problems while doing all this, should the task arise. A few doors down, a woman is patching a coat with thread the exact color of determination. She sits near a small window, taking advantage of the thin stripe of daylight that sneaks in. Every stitch is precise, the kind that transforms worn fabric into something that might survive one more winter. She pauses only to tell her younger sister to stop swinging the chair so hard before the entire household acquires a new set of injuries they do not have time for. The sister mutters. The chair stops, and the sewing continues, uninterrupted and unstoppable. In a cramped kitchen space, a woman stirs a pot with the authority of someone who has mastered the fine art of making enough food out of not nearly enough ingredients. She tastes the broth, adds a pinch of something from a jar with a faded label, and declares it ready. Her husband drifts by, offering a suggestion she does not even acknowledge. Instead, she hands him a bowl and sends him outside to fetch water. He obeys with the resigned acceptance of someone who knows she is the only reason he has clean clothes, hot meals, and the occasional semblance of order in their lives. Everywhere you turn, the same pattern emerges. The women carry the slum on their backs, steady and unyielding. They are the ones who negotiate with landlords, mend bruised knees, stretch meals, settle arguments, and keep the fragile balance of daily life intact. They do it quietly, without fanfare, their labor tucked into the corners of the day where no one thinks to look. You notice how rarely anyone stops to thank them, not out of malice, but out of the simple truth that their work is so constant it becomes invisible. Yet when you watch closely, you see the power behind every movement they make. There is resilience in the way they straighten a crooked shelf, and tenderness in the way they hush a fretting child, and fire in the way they face down a problem with nothing but resourcefulness and a deeply unimpressed expression. In Old Nichol Street, the walls may be thin, the food scarce, the nights uneasy, but the women hold everything together with a strength that is both quiet and monumental. Without them, the slum would crumble long before the buildings ever did. You wander into a part of Old Nichol Street where the air feels heavier, as if it has been carrying secrets for too long and is beginning to resent the weight. The buildings lean closer here, their windows half shuttered, their doorways half hidden. People move differently too, slipping through the alleys with a quiet purpose that makes you instinctively soften your footsteps. You are not unwelcome, exactly, but you are definitely being observed by eyes that prefer to remain anonymous. A man stands at a corner with a crate at his feet, calling out an offer that sounds innocent until you hear the emphasis he places on certain words. He sells trinkets mostly, little items that appear harmless, but his real trade becomes obvious when he lifts a blanket to reveal a small stash of pocket watches and lockets that definitely did not start the morning in his possession. He smiles at you in a way that suggests he is not judging your moral compass so much as testing its flexibility. You decline politely, and he shrugs with the ease of someone who knows another customer will wander by soon enough. A few steps farther, you stumble upon a group of boys who could not be more than 12 years old. They whisper excitedly around a bag filled with items that look far too valuable to be lying in the dirt. One of them spots you and straightens, his expression shifting into practiced neutrality. The others follow his lead, melting into the alley's shadows with a kind of speed that comes from a lifetime of knowing when to vanish. You get the sense that these boys learned long ago that survival often arrives disguised as opportunity, and that opportunity rarely waits for permission. A woman approaches you next, her coat patched, her posture bold. She offers homemade remedies that promise cures for everything from coughs to heartbreak. Her jars clink together as she lifts them from her basket, but the contents look questionable even in the dim light. You thank her and try to move on, but she laughs softly and tells you that half the slum survives on things more mysterious than what she sells. Her words linger with you as she walks away, humming a tune that sounds older than the street itself. Then you meet a man who repairs locks. At least, that is what he claims, though he mentions with a sly wink that he can also help with locks that need opening under less official circumstances. His tools are arranged neatly in a roll of cloth, gleaming with thin layers of careful polish. He explains that helping someone in distress is not a crime, though distress is a flexible term and often depends on who is telling the story. You watch him pick apart a rusted hinge with the skill of a surgeon and wonder how many doors in this slum have opened or closed at his persuasion. As you continue, you notice more subtle dealings. A pair of men passing packets between sleeves, a quick exchange of coins behind a stack of crates, a woman trading information with the precision of a banker who deals in gossip rather than gold. Everywhere you look, something is happening just beneath the surface, flowing quietly but steadily, like an underground river guiding the slum's pulse. What becomes clear is that crime here is less a choice and more a language spoken out of necessity. People take what they must, trade what they can, and stretch every rule thin enough to see daylight through it. Morality bends, not out of malice, but because survival in Old Nichol Street comes with its own dictionary of acceptable behavior. As you leave the alley, the shadows seem to shift behind you, rearranging themselves around other stories, other exchanges. You realize that in this part of the slum, the line between right and wrong is not a line at all. It is a smudge, blurred by hands that have had no other option but to create their own way through the night. You push open a warped wooden door and step into a room that feels as if someone gathered every definition of the word crowded, mixed them together, and decided the result would make an excellent pub. The heat hits you first. A thick wave of warmth rolling off bodies pressed so close together it looks like the entire slum has gathered to escape the night. The smell follows, a blend of spilled ale, damp wool, and the unmistakable aroma of stew. Someone has been reheating since the dawn of civilization. You inhale cautiously, just in case. The place is lit by a few smoky lamps that give off more determination than actual light. Shadows cling to the corners like regular patrons. A fire crackles in a stove at the back, though the stove itself seems to be losing the will to participate. People cluster around it anyway, soaking in whatever heat it has left to offer. You weave your way through the crowd, careful not to bump into anyone holding something sharp, flammable, or emotionally unstable. A man at a makeshift bar nods at you, wiping a mug with a cloth that does nothing to improve the mug. He gestures toward a barrel and informs you, with great pride, that tonight's drink is stronger than last week's. You are not entirely sure this is a selling point, since last week's batch caused two men to attempt a philosophical debate with a wall. Still, you take a cup. It warms your hands instantly, and your throat moments later, with a burn that suggests the drink might double as lamp fuel. The room hums with conversation, rising and falling in waves. Laughter bursts from one corner while an argument simmers in another, voices sharp enough to slice through the smoky air. A group of men lean over a battered table, playing cards with the intensity of generals plotting a campaign. Beside them, two women share a quiet joke that sends them into a fit of muffled giggles. The pub is a strange mixture of tension and comfort, as if everyone has silently agreed never to ask how the warmth was achieved. A fiddler sits on a crate near the hearth, coaxing a tune from his instrument that somehow competes with the noise. People tap their feet, sway slightly, or hum along with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from finally finding a place where the cold cannot reach them. The floorboards vibrate beneath you, alive with the movement of boots, shoes, and the occasional bare foot that darts past too quickly for you to identify. You settle at a corner table, watching as the room shifts around you. A man with a scar across his cheek sits down, uninvited, grinning as if he has known you for years. He asks where you are from, then laughs before you can answer, declaring confidently that no one is from here unless they have bad luck or worse choices. The comment earns him a playful shove from a friend and a round of teasing from the people nearby. Even the dangerous men here seem to understand the value of humor. Yet beneath the laughter there is something else, a subtle tension that flickers like a draft near the door. Every now and then someone glances at the entrance, checking who comes and goes. A moment of quiet ripples through the room whenever a stranger steps in, a brief weighing of intentions. But warmth resumes just as quickly, the pub swallowing unease the way it swallows spilled ale. You sip your drink again and let the atmosphere settle around you. It feels like sitting inside a secret shared by too many people to remain hidden, yet too vital to abandon. Here, danger lounges beside comfort, and no one seems particularly bothered by the arrangement. In Old Nichol Street, this is what passes for sanctuary, a place where the fire burns low, the drink burns high, and the night outside feels a little less sharp while you remain inside its dim and noisy shelter. You do not intend to overhear anything, yet the slum insists on telling you everything anyway. It starts with a whispered comment drifting out of a doorway as you pass. Something about a man who fell into a coal cart because he insisted he was not drunk, only philosophically unbalanced. You smile to yourself and keep walking, assuming the story will remain where it originated. It does not. 3 steps later, a woman leaning out of a window repeats the same tale with new details, including that the man actually argued with the coal before falling into it. By the time you reach the corner, the incident has evolved into a full performance involving shouting, slipping, and a memorable moment where the man claimed the cart attacked to him. You soon learn that gossip in Old Nichol Street does not travel, it sprints. 2 boys run past you, breathless with excitement, announcing that someone on the next street is planning to move house. The news seems simple enough until you reach the alley, where the story has already been inflated into a grand departure involving a cart, a goat, and possibly a minor scandal. You overhear 3 versions within 60 seconds. One suggests the man is moving because his roof finally gave up and collapsed. Another insists he is fleeing a landlord with a temper. A third says he is chasing love across the city, though the speaker admits she cannot remember whose love it is or whether that person knows about it. You pause to tie your boot and accidentally position yourself within earshot of 2 women who are peeling vegetables on a stoop. They speak in quick bursts, matching their words to the rhythm of their hands. They discuss a family quarrel that apparently echoed loud enough for half the slum to enjoy as informal entertainment. One woman explains the argument with such dramatic flair you would think she had been hired as a narrator. When she reaches the climax of the story, she lowers her voice and leans forward so conspiratorially that you instinctively lean forward too, despite knowing full well you are not part of the audience she meant to include. A man hauling crates down the street pauses to offer his own version of the same incident, adding a detail that involves a flying loaf of bread. 20 steps later, a girl hanging laundry claims the bread was not thrown but dropped. A boy sitting on a barrel interrupts to declare confidently that there was no bread at all, only a loud misunderstanding about socks. No one questions these contradictions. In the slum, stories are less about truth and more about momentum. You pass a cluster of older men playing a game you cannot identify. Every time one of them slaps a card down, he contributes a new rumor. Someone is getting married. Someone else is getting arrested. A cat has gone missing and will not be missed very much. Another cat has been found and adopted by a family who insists this cat is definitely the same one they had before, despite obvious differences. The men nod solemnly at each new revelation, as though each piece of information is both perfectly credible and deeply significant. What fascinates you most is how seamlessly gossip moves between strangers. Someone mutters something under their breath, someone else overhears, and suddenly the entire street has an opinion. These narrow passages act like the acoustic chambers of rumor, carrying voices farther than they have any right to travel. You realize that even the walls here seem to listen. By late afternoon, you hear your own presence being discussed behind your back with surprising accuracy and surprising inaccuracy in equal measure. Someone claims you are a writer. Someone else says you are a distant cousin of a man who once lived here. A child boldly offers the theory that you are a spy sent from a bakery to test the quality of local bread. In Old Nichol Street, gossip is the bloodstream of the community, circulating through every corridor, whispering through every doorway, and stitching lives together through the simple act of storytelling. It moves faster than light, faster than footsteps, faster than denial, and you know that by tomorrow morning, you will be part of it too. You first notice the policemen by the sound of their boots, that heavy, practiced rhythm meant to project confidence. But when they turn into Old Nichol Street, that confidence thins noticeably, like butter scraped over too much stale bread. Two officers walk ahead of you, shoulders squared, expressions stern, but their eyes flick around the slum with the alertness of men who know they have entered territory that respects uniforms far less than it respects unspoken rules. Their pace slows a little, just enough to betray their caution. They greet a few residents with forced politeness, the kind that tries very hard to be firm without causing a scene. The residents reply with equally forced politeness, the kind that stretches thin over amusement. You can see the tiniest glint in their eyes, a spark that says they understand the truth the officers are trying to disguise. Authority means something different here, and everyone knows it. The patrol continues down the main street, but when the officers reach a narrow alley branching to the left, they exchange a glance and keep walking. There is no comment, no explanation, just a subtle, mutual agreement that this corner is best left undisturbed. A woman selling vegetables nearby watches them pass and shakes her head, muttering something under her breath that you suspect is not particularly flattering. You try to peer down the alley they avoided, but a boy immediately steps in front of you and tells you you will want to save that curiosity for a day when you have several backup lives to spare. As you follow the patrol at a distance, you begin to spot the places they choose not to enter. A doorway framed by peeling paint, a stretch of wall where the shadows are just a little too thick, a courtyard where a group of men sit quietly, not menacing, but possessing a stillness that radiates a very clear message. Do not interrupt. Each time the officers near one of these areas, they suddenly grow fascinated with the opposite direction. Eventually, the patrol stops to speak with a landlord who is pretending his building is not disintegrating behind him. He assures them everything on the property is perfectly safe, punctuating his claim with a confident gesture that causes a loose brick to fall off the wall and land at his feet. The officers attempt to maintain authority while stepping discreetly away from danger, nodding at his explanation with the resigned professionalism of men who know they will accomplish nothing by arguing. A few children gather at the end of the lane, whispering and giggling. One of them imitates the stiff posture of the officers so accurately that you almost applaud. Another mimics the clipped tone of their instructions, earning a round of laughter. The policemen do not notice, or perhaps they choose not to. It is difficult to tell which choice is wiser. As the patrol turns back toward the safer parts of the district, their shoulders loosen, their pace quickens, and the air around them lightens as though they have crossed an invisible border. One officer wipes his brow and mutters something about the smell. The other says nothing, staring straight ahead with the expression of a man silently vowing never to mention this shift again if he can help it. Watching them retreat, you understand something crucial. In Old Nichol Street, authority exists, but only in carefully negotiated fragments. The badge may hold power elsewhere, but here, the slum answers to older forces, unwritten rules, quiet alliances, and the collective understanding of a community that governs itself out of necessity. You walk on, knowing that the places the officers avoid are the places where this hidden order grows strongest, shaping the slum more effectively than any official patrol ever could. You meet him when he appears beside you without warning, as if he has stepped directly out of the brickwork. One moment, you are walking down Old Nichol Street, minding your own business, and the next you are accompanied by a man who greets you with a cheerful nod and an introduction so smooth you barely process it before he is already explaining the price of bread on different corners. He speaks quickly, but not hurriedly, the way someone does when they have lived in one place long enough to memorize its every pulse. He is a small man, thin as a railing, wrapped in a coat that looks like it has absorbed 40 winters. Yet there is an undeniable energy in his eyes, sharp and observing, flicking from window to doorway to passerby. With effortless precision, He asks you what brings you to this part of the city, though he clearly already has theories of his own. Before you can answer, he offers 3 possible explanations, 2 of which are far more exciting than the truth. He laughs softly to himself and gestures for you to follow. As you walk, he greets everyone you pass. A nod to a woman sweeping her doorstep, a wave to a tailor mending a sleeve, a few quick words to a man selling cigarettes so questionable that even his own conscience seems confused. Each greeting is different, tailored, intentional. The fixer reads people with a fluency that startles you. He knows which neighbor is in need of good news, who can handle a joke, who must be spoken to gently, and who absolutely must not be disturbed until after they have had their morning tea. He leads you down an alley you would have avoided on your own, explaining as he walks that this is the quickest route to the best baker in the slum. Before you can wonder why a slum has rankings for bakeries, you are introduced to a woman who pulls bread from an oven the size of a coffin and hands slices to children who do not even need to ask. The fixer speaks to her with warm familiarity, praising her consistency and whispering that she should raise her prices. She rolls her eyes and tells him he talks too much, which he gracefully accepts as a compliment. Then he guides you to a courtyard where a group of men sit sharpening tools. He explains who is trustworthy, who can repair anything mechanical, and who you should never owe money to under any circumstances. His tone makes it clear that he has personal experience with all 3 categories. The men nod respectfully as he passes. Even the one who looks like he wrestles furniture for recreation softens slightly at the fixer's presence. You begin to realize that he is not only informed, but indispensable. People ask him questions in passing. They touch his shoulder for guidance. They listen to his warnings with the kind of seriousness normally reserved for doctors or fortune tellers. He seems to carry an invisible list of who needs help and who can offer it, keeping the slum functioning through pure organization and relentless observation. At one point, he stops abruptly and stares down an alley with the focus of a hunter catching scent. He announces that someone in the next street is about to make a mistake. You ask what kind of mistake, but he simply shakes his head and says that in Old Nichol Street, predicting the type is far less important than predicting the timing. He strides off, returning a few minutes later with a smug grin and a story he refuses to tell you. The details, he insists, are best left to the participants. As the day goes on, you feel yourself pulled into the orbit of a man who knows every crack in the pavement, every feud between families, every shortcut, every danger, and every possibility for opportunity. He does not brag about his knowledge. He simply moves through the slum with the quiet assurance of someone who understands that being useful is a kind of power. By the time you part ways, you realize you have been given a tour not just of the streets, but of the slum's hidden skeleton, and every bone of it seems to connect back to him. You begin to sense hunger long before your stomach joins in. It hangs in the air the way fog clings to the river, faint at first, then steadily impossible to ignore. People move differently on an empty stomach. They scan doorways for the scent of anything warm, pace the streets with a focus that has nothing to do with leisure, and negotiate with their own bodies as though trying to coax one more hour of strength out of them. You feel it as you walk, the slum breathing in time with appetite. A woman near a doorway stirs a pot that emits a smell both comforting and deeply ambiguous. Children drift toward her like moths to a promise, each one stretching on tiptoe to see what might be cooking. She shoos them away with gentle authority, not unkind, just honest about the fact that there is not enough to share. When she lifts the lid again, you glimpse a stew so thin it looks almost transparent, yet she stirs it with a reverence that suggests it is the centerpiece of her evening. Across the street, a man scavenges through a crate that once belonged to a grocer. He studies each bruised apple and broken carrot with more scrutiny than some people reserve for diamonds. He pockets the pieces that seem salvageable, muttering to himself about how a clever cook can stretch anything if they have patience and a strong stomach. He speaks like someone halfway between optimistic and slightly delusional, which seems to be the preferred mindset for making meals in Old Nichol Street. You pass a boy, carrying a loaf so small it barely qualifies as bread. He guards it with the seriousness of a knight protecting a sacred relic, elbowing away anyone who tries to peer at it. A younger sibling chases him, demanding a share, and he hesitates only a moment before tearing off a chunk and handing it over. The gesture is reluctant but tender, and you see how hunger cannot snuff out loyalty, even when it tries its best. Morning routines revolve around the hope of food. Afternoon routines revolve around the search for it. Evening routines revolve around pretending the day was satisfying enough to sleep on. You watch families sit together for their meal, heads bowed not in prayer, but in concentration, dividing portions with mathematical precision. Each bite is savored, discussed, praised, because there may not be a second helping and certainly not a third. People eat slowly, drawing out the experience as though stretching time might stretch the taste too. You hear arguments sparked by nothing more than empty stomachs. Tension rises in doorways, sharp words fly between friends, and even children grow short-tempered when the day grows long and their bellies remain hollow. Hunger turns minor inconveniences into full events, and you begin to understand how many conflicts in this place have been born from nothing more dramatic than a missed meal. Even the stray animals seem shaped by it. Cats patrol the alleys with military focus, pouncing on anything that twitches. Dogs linger near doorways, hoping for a scrap that might fall through mercy or accident. They know the routines as well as the people do, and they weave themselves into the daily rhythm like unofficial residents. What strikes you most is how hunger dictates movement. People walk toward the market even when they know they cannot buy. They circulate around the bakeries at certain hours, hoping for leftover crumbs or the kindness of someone in a generous mood. They pause near windows where a faint aroma drifts out, allowing themselves one moment to imagine a different life. Hunger is not just a feeling here. It is a compass, pointing everyone toward their next decision, their next step, their next compromise. And as you follow these movements through the slum, you feel yourself pulled into the same tide, aware that every growling stomach is a reminder of how much this place endures with so little to offer back. Night settles over Old Nichol Street like a heavy coat, thick and frayed at the edges, but the slum refuses to grow quiet. Instead, it shifts into a different rhythm, one built from tired laughter, soft singing, and the clatter of mismatched cups being filled with whatever drink someone managed to warm over a stubborn flame. You are drawn toward the sound almost unconsciously, your feet following a trail of faint music weaving through the alleys like a thread guiding you deeper into the maze. You find the gathering in a courtyard you would have walked past without noticing in daylight. But now it glows with the flicker of lanterns hung from windows and nailed to boards that probably should not be nailed to anything. People sit on crates, overturned buckets, and a suspicious pile of cushions whose origin no one discusses. The air smells of smoke, damp wool, and a stew someone has contributed even though it contains more hope than ingredients. You step inside the circle and receive a nod of welcome, the kind extended to anyone willing to listen, to share the night, or at least to keep quiet during the good parts of a song. A man with a fiddle stands near the center, coaxing out a melody that sounds both joyful and exhausted. His bow moves like it is carrying the weight of every story told on these streets, yet somehow lifts them too, making the cold air feel warmer than it should. A woman beside him taps a rhythm on a tin, her hands steady, her voice humming harmonies as though she has known this tune her entire life. Children sway beside her, half asleep but refusing to go to bed when music offers a better dream. As you settle in, you notice how easily misery settles beside merriment here, not as opposites but as companions. A man tells a joke about his own misfortunes, and the crowd bursts into laughter because they understand misfortune intimately and have learned that humor is the only tool sharp enough to carve dignity out of it. A woman next to him wipes her eyes from laughing, then immediately slips into a quiet confession about her husband's illness, her voice trembling only once before she steadies it with the sip of a drink. People around her nod, murmur, offer small comforts. No one pretends to have solutions, but solidarity here has its own power. A boy no older than 10 begins to sing a tune he has patched together from street songs and lullabies. His voice cracks in places, but he sings boldly anyway, swinging his arms as if conducting an orchestra instead of a few neighbors gathered on worn stones. The adults listen with a mix of pride and melancholy, understanding that childhood in Old Nichol Street is brief and that joy, when it appears, should be applauded loudly enough to be remembered. Closer to the fire, 2 men argue about the lyrics of an old ballad, each insisting his version is correct, despite neither remembering the full song. Their bickering becomes part of the entertainment, and someone hands them another drink to encourage a truce. It works only briefly, but the temporary peace is good enough. Then the music shifts, softening, slowing, turning into something almost tender. Conversations fade as the melody drifts upward, settling over everyone like a blanket stitched from shared exhaustion. You watch faces illuminated by lantern light, worn and lined, yet softened for this moment. People lean on each other lightly, heads touching, shoulders resting, every posture reflecting the strange truth that collective weariness can feel almost celebratory when shared openly. You realize that nights like this are not escapes from misery, but acknowledgments of it, a way of saying we are still here, still breathing, still capable of singing even when the world offers nothing to sing about. The mingling of sorrow and song creates a feeling richer than happiness, deeper than grief, something closer to endurance shaped into sound. You stay until the lanterns burn low, until the music thins into gentle humming, until the night itself seems to settle down with the crowd. And as you finally rise to leave, you carry with you the warmth of that fragile harmony, a warmth that lingers even as the cold slips back in behind you. It starts with a smell before it becomes a sound. That faint, sharp tang that lifts the hairs on your arms even before your mind understands why. You are walking past a narrow row of houses when someone shouts the word fire, and suddenly the slum's pulse changes. Doors fly open, windows slam shut. People surge toward the source, while others race in the opposite direction, moving with the frantic instinct of those who know how quickly Old Nichol Street can turn into a tinderbox. You feel the fear spread like a second fire, rushing ahead of the flames themselves. A woman grabs her children and pushes them toward the street, her voice tight as she orders them not to look back. A man bursts from a doorway carrying a blanket soaked in water, the fabric dripping as he runs. He nearly collides with you before veering away, muttering a prayer under his breath while trying to convince himself it will help more than it actually will. The flames have not yet shown themselves, but smoke curls from a rooftop with unnerving confidence. It creeps upward into the night air, a slow, dark ribbon that promises nothing good. The houses crowd so close together that you can almost imagine the fire stepping easily from one roof to the next, making the slum its personal playground. Someone shouts for water. Someone else shouts that there is hardly any. A bucket line forms anyway, a desperate chain of hands passing hope in small, sloshing amounts. People arrive from every corner, drawn by instinct and dread. You see men who moments ago looked half dead, with exhaustion suddenly moving with sharp focus, hauling barrels, tearing down loose boards, shouting instructions that contradict each other but are issued with equal conviction. Women run for blankets, shawls, anything that might smother sparks before they spread. Children hover at the edges, wide-eyed and trembling, ready to run errands they do not fully understand. A sudden crack splits the air, the sound of wood surrendering. The noise jolts through the crowd like a shock wave. For a heartbeat, the entire street freezes, and in that stillness you hear the fire at last, the low, hungry roar of something finding its strength. Then everything erupts again. People scramble onto crates to get a better view, while others push them down, insisting the height is dangerous. A man climbs a ladder only for 3 neighbors to drag him back down, yelling that he will fall before he helps anyone. You catch sight of the fixer you met earlier, directing people with surprising authority. He points to a narrow passage and orders it cleared before the fire can trap families inside. People listen without argument. Even in the chaos, some voices cut through the noise more effectively than others. You join the bucket line, passing water that feels pathetically inadequate, yet somehow necessary, as though the act itself keeps panic from consuming the crowd entirely. At last, after what feels like an eternity held in a single breath, someone shouts that the fire is dying. Smoke thins. The frantic movement slows. The flames never catch fully, beaten back by wet blankets, cold stones, and pure, stubborn refusal. Relief floods the street so quickly it makes you dizzy. People sag against walls, lean on each other, and laugh shakily, as though laughter might shake the fear loose from their bones. The danger ebbs, leaving behind charred wood, shaken nerves, and a strange sense of triumph. In a place this fragile, any fire averted feels like a victory carved out of impossible odds. You stand, in the smoky air, heart still racing, aware now of how thin the line is between ordinary night and disaster, and how fiercely the people of Old Nichol Street fight to keep that line from disappearing. You start noticing it the way you might notice a hidden pattern in wallpaper, something subtle that suddenly snaps into focus. At first it seems like ordinary conversation, a few neighbors exchanging remarks about weather or laundry or who has borrowed whose bucket again. But then you watch how those small exchanges turn into something more coordinated, more deliberate, like threads quietly being tied together out of sight. Old Nichol Street may look chaotic from the outside, but beneath its rough surface runs a web of cooperation so intricate you wonder how you missed it earlier. A woman carrying a basket pauses at a doorway to ask whether a newborn has enough blankets. She does not wait for a full answer before handing over 2 from her own pile, explaining that she can stitch more later. Another neighbor steps forward, promising to look in on the new mother the next morning. No one writes anything down. They simply nod at each other, trusting the promise because this is how things get done here. Farther along, you watch a man repairing a broken chair for a family who cannot afford a replacement. He whistles as he works, using tools so worn they look like they were found in the ruins of an ancient village. When the chair is fixed, he waves away payment and instead mentions that his roof leaks again. Within minutes, 3 people offer to help patch it before the next rain, and the entire arrangement unfolds with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed troupe. You pass a cramped kitchen where a woman is preparing a pot of soup larger than her household could ever finish. She tells you it is for everyone who needs a hot meal tonight, which apparently includes half the slum. She lists the families who will come by later, each person linked to another through a string of reasons ranging from illness to misfortune to simple exhaustion. She stirs the pot with a calm that suggests she has done this 100 times without waiting for recognition. In another alley, a teenager quietly hands a loaf of bread to an older man leaning against a wall. There is no dramatic gesture, no speech, just a brief exchange of eye contact that carries more weight than words. You see similar moments again and again, small acts of care passed along like clandestine gifts. A child fetches water for a neighbor whose leg is injured. A group of women organize a rotation to watch each other's children while they work. A man known for his temper unexpectedly steps aside to let a frail woman pass first, muttering something that sounds suspiciously like kindness disguised as irritation. Even the local fixer you met earlier moves through this network with ease, nudging support where it is needed, making introductions between people who can help each other, and smoothing conflicts before they turn into problems. He does not issue orders. He simply hints, gestures, suggests, and people respond, because cooperation here is not a duty, it is survival. The most surprising part is how unspoken it all is. There are no meetings, no written agreements, no declarations about community spirit. The help flows naturally, responding to need with the same instinct people use to sense weather shifts. You see it in glances exchanged across doorways, in the way someone steps toward a cry before thinking, in the way goods and effort move quietly through the alleys without fanfare. These networks work faster than any official agency could dream of. While distant offices send forms and instructions, Old Nichol Street sends hands and feet and warm bowls of food. While authorities debate responsibility, neighbors simply do what needs doing. You realize that for all its disorder and hardship, the slum holds itself together through a kind of invisible architecture, stronger than any, bricks that fail to keep out the cold. By the time you leave the street that evening, you understand that the true foundations of this place are not made of wood or stone. They are made of people who learn to lean on each other because no one else will, weaving a support system more dependable than anything written in a ledger or signed with an official seal. You notice it first in the coughs. They drift through Old Nichol Street, the way chimney soot drifts through the air, subtle at a distance but impossible to ignore once you are surrounded by them. A short bark of a cough here, a long, wet one there, each echoing through thin walls and narrow alleys like part of the slum's nightly soundtrack. At first you think it is just the cold settling into bones, the damp creeping into lungs, but the more time you spend here, the more you understand the truth everyone already knows but rarely says aloud. Illness in this place is not an occasional visitor. It is a permanent tenant, refusing to leave even when the rent is overdue. You see a child rubbing his nose with a sleeve already stiff from earlier attempts. His mother wipes his forehead with the back of her hand, sighs, and sends him to play anyway, because keeping him indoors offers no real improvement. Another child sneezes into the air, completely unbothered by the idea of covering a mouth. The sneeze lands somewhere near a row of laundry, trying its best to dry in weather that refuses to cooperate. You watch the fabric sway and wonder how many germs have decided to take up residence in those threadbare sheets before they even make it back onto a bed. Inside a cramped room, a man lies under a blanket that barely qualifies as warm. He shivers in short, sharp spasms while a woman boils water and pours it into a chipped cup. She hands him a mixture of herbs and hope, neither of which has the strength to cure him, but both of which she offers with steady hands. She tells you he has been sick for days, then quickly adds that he is not the only one. Illness moves through the slum the same way gossip does, quietly at first, then suddenly, everywhere. You walk past a group of women scrubbing floors with a determination that feels almost personal, as if they are trying to ward off the unseen with sheer force of will. They talk about fevers and chills, recounting symptoms with the expertise of seasoned physicians who lack every tool except experience. They describe how someone's son grew pale, how someone's husband could not rise from bed, how a neighbor lost her appetite and her voice in the same week. Their words carry no panic, just weary acceptance. Sickness is woven into daily life here, an inconvenience that too often becomes something more. In another alley, an older man sits on a stool, coughing into a cloth he keeps tucked in his coat. The cloth has seen better days. He claims it is nothing, insists he has felt worse, announces that a bit of fresh air will straighten him out. You doubt the fresh air here has ever straightened anything except laundry lines, but you keep that thought to yourself. He stands, takes 2 steps, and sits back down with a groan that betrays everything his bravado tries to hide. You watch as a woman distributes small jars of homemade remedies, each one promising relief, even if not cure. She knows who cannot pay, and hands them a jar anyway. You hear her mutter that a slum cannot afford to lose its people. The words sound harsh, but her eyes soften each time she offers comfort, even when it is only a warm hand on a feverish brow. The illness itself remains unseen, slipping around corners, riding the damp on walls, settling into lungs with the quiet confidence of something that knows it cannot be evicted. It finds the weakest easily, but it also nips constantly at the strongest, reminding everyone here that good health is more borrowed than owned. By the time you step back into the street, you understand completely. Disease in Old Nichol Street does not announce itself with fanfare or drama. It simply stays, It lingers in breaths, clings to fabric, and settles into the cracks the way cold settles into stone. It is the slum's most dependable resident, and the only one who never needs to knock. You learn the story in pieces, gathered the way the slum itself gathers things, pulled from corners and carried by voices that do not always agree on details, but agree entirely on the weight of them. Someone tells you, Old Nichol Street was never meant to be what it is now. Long ago, before the roofs sagged and the walls leaned like drunks supporting each other, this land belonged to quiet orchards and modest cottages. You try to imagine trees where chimneys now cough smoke into the sky, but the image dissolves almost instantly beneath the grime and noise that define the present. A man repairing a fence explains that the first blow came when the city grew impatient and hungry. Factories sprouted like weeds, and workers arrived faster than anyone could house them. The cottages were bought, torn apart, and replaced with cramped buildings stacked close enough to share illnesses and arguments through the walls. He gestures at a row of structures that seem held together by stubbornness alone and tells you they were once considered modern. The word modern hangs in the air like a joke that refuses to laugh. Later, an older woman sitting by a window fills in more of the story. She tells you how landlords discovered that misery could be profitable. They packed families into rooms barely large enough for a bed and raised the rent whenever someone managed to earn an extra penny. Repairs were ignored, cracks widened, floors rotted, but as long as the money flowed upward, no one with authority bothered to look downward. She sighs and says the slum grew not by design but by neglect, an ink blot left to spread until it became its own geography. You walk farther and meet a shopkeeper who claims the slum hardened during a series of harsh winters when people arrived from other desperate corners of the city. He describes waves of newcomers chasing rumors of work, arriving with nothing but calloused hands and thin coats. Jobs were few, rooms even fewer, and the overcrowding worsened until privacy became a myth and quiet an impossible luxury. He points to the narrow alleys and says they were never planned. They simply formed as makeshift paths between hastily built structures, twisting until they forgot how to straighten. One evening, as lanterns flicker weakly, a retired factory worker sitting outside his home tells you the part of the tale that no one else mentions with such frankness. The city authorities knew exactly what this place had become. Reports were written, committees were formed, inspections were conducted at a safe distance, but doing anything about it would have required time, money, and a willingness to see the residents as something other than an inconvenient shadow on the map. So Old Nichol Street remained untouched, tucked between districts that prided themselves on respectability, hidden not by walls but by indifference. With every story, the picture sharpens. This slum was not built in a single stroke. It was created by decisions made far away from its streets, shaped by priorities that never included the people who would end up living here. It grew because no one stopped it. It decayed because no one cared enough to repair it. And now it stands as a half-forgotten pocket of suffering, visible to anyone who bothers to look but ignored by most who pass nearby. As you walk its length again, you feel the weight of these histories in the sagging roofs, the broken steps, the weary faces. Old Nichol Street did not simply happen. It was allowed to happen. It was pushed into existence by progress elsewhere, then left to crumble quietly as if decay were a natural phase of life. And standing in the middle of it, you finally understand why the people here cling so fiercely to be one another. The world beyond the slum may pretend not to see them, but inside these twisted alleys, they refuse to let themselves disappear. You begin to notice the history not because anyone points it out, but because the slum itself keeps tripping you with reminders. A worn stone doorstep dips in the middle, carved down by generations of feet that never paused long enough to imagine they were leaving their mark. A cracked wall leans forward as though listening, its bricks uneven and mismatched from centuries of repairs done in hurry, frustration, or resignation. Everywhere you look, Old Nichol Street feels like a stack of centuries piled on top of one another, each layer adding its own ruin to the next. You walk past a row of houses so ancient they seem to sag from the burden of remembering too much. A woman tells you the buildings once belonged to tradesmen back when the neighborhood had dignity and chimneys that did not belch despair. She taps the wall beside her and says the structure is older than her grandmother's grandmother, then shrugs and adds that it has held together this long, mostly out of spite. You run your hand along the uneven surface and feel the distinct sensation that the building is just barely tolerating existence. Farther along, you pass the remains of an old workshop. Its doorway is half collapsed, its sign long faded, and its windows clouded by grime so thick it blurs your own reflection. A man sweeping the street explains that centuries ago, this place produced fine furniture, the kind wealthy families boasted about. Now the only thing produced here is dust, layered thick enough to qualify as a historical artifact. He laughs at his own joke, then adds quietly that in this part of the city, decay is simply another tradition handed down. As you continue, you notice how the roads twist in ways no sensible planner would have allowed. They were not designed, you are told, but inherited. Paths widened where horses once turned carts, then narrowed again when buildings encroached, each generation adjusting the layout without ever correcting it. The result is a maze where every corner remembers a different century, and none of those centuries had anything resembling mercy. An old iron post juts from the ground near a doorway. You assume it once tethered horses, until a passerby informs you it was used to secure drunks who needed to sleep off their troubles while remaining in reach of public ridicule. He points out that the tradition of public shame has continued in different ways, but the post remains because no one bothers to remove relics that are not actively falling on people. You pause beside a crumbling arch that might once have been decorative. Now it tilts dangerously, supported by a plank so thin it looks like a sarcastic gesture. Beneath the arch lies a narrow passageway leading to several homes squeezed together like argumentative siblings. The stones in the passage are uneven, each one sunken in a way that suggests generations attempted to fix them, but eventually accepted that the stones had their own preferences. Standing there, you feel the weight of all the decisions that led to this moment. The slum is not simply worn from time. It is worn from mistakes that no one ever took the blame for. Hasty construction that became permanent, neglect that calcified into tradition, poverty passed down as reliably as hair color. Every brick seems to whisper a reminder that suffering does not start fresh each generation, but arrives with a lineage. You look around and realize Old Nichol Street is not haunted by ghosts. It is haunted by choices made long ago, choices that still echo through its alleys, shaping lives that never had a chance to make different ones. The past here never went away. It simply moved in and refused to leave. You notice them before they even open their mouths. They arrive in clusters, wrapped in coats so polished they look allergic to dust, stepping into Old Nichol Street with the cautious awe of people entering a museum exhibit rather than a neighborhood where real lives unfold. Their eyes widen at the crooked houses and narrow alleys, their expressions hovering somewhere between fascination and distaste. You can almost hear their thoughts before they speak, the silent questions shaped entirely by distance and comfort. A pair of well-dressed visitors stop near a puddle that reflects more soot than sky. The woman lifts her skirts as though the water might leap upward and ruin her future. She whispers to her companion that she cannot imagine how anyone lives here, saying it loudly enough that half the street hears her. A man repairing a boot just a few feet away glances up, his face expressionless, but his silence carries enough meaning to fill the alley. Farther along, a young gentleman with a cane taps it against the cobblestones, testing them as though checking if they are structurally sound enough to support his presence. He marvels at the cramped houses, calling them quaint in the same tone someone might use to describe exotic animals. A group of children watch him curiously. One boy mimics the way he walks, nose lifted high, cane imaginary, but but handled with expert mockery. The gentleman remains blissfully unaware that he is providing free entertainment. You follow another group as they make their way through the maze of alleys. They point at laundry lines strung above their heads, commenting on how untidy everything looks, never considering that people must hang their clothes somewhere. One woman takes out a notebook and scribbles observations with the enthusiasm of a researcher writing about creatures in the wild. She describes the slum as if it were a spectacle, and you wonder whether she realizes that the people she studies are watching her in return. At a street corner, an older couple pause in front of a group of residents gathered around a pot cooking over a shared fire. The couple exchange looks steeped in pity, their hands clasped as though steadying themselves against the shock of poverty existing within walking distance of their comfortable homes. They offer nothing but commentary, expressing sadness without responsibility, shaking their heads before moving on to the next scene, like they are turning pages in a book they have no intention of helping rewrite. A few visitors try to mask their judgment with polite smiles, but the discomfort betrays them. They speak gently, almost theatrically, as if careful not to provoke the locals, unaware that such caution itself reveals how little they understand. They ask questions about daily life, but their tone suggests they expect answers that will amuse or horrify them. When the locals respond plainly, the visitors nod sympathetically and then wander off, satisfied with their brief brush against hardship. What strikes you most is how visibly the residents react. Some meet the visitors' stares with hardened indifference, too familiar with this brand of curiosity to bother hiding their annoyance. Others retreat into their homes or busy themselves with chores, refusing to perform their struggles for an audience. A few lean into humor, exaggerating gestures or offering sarcastic comments that fly entirely over the heads of their spectators. The fixer you met earlier stands at a corner and watches the entire procession with narrowed eyes, muttering something about people who treat suffering like scenery. As you continue walking, you see the final stage of the ritual. The visitors eventually decide they have seen enough. They leave with relieved sighs, stepping back into wider streets where the air feels less heavy, congratulating themselves on being charitable enough to care from a distance. They shake off the slum the way one might shake off dust from a coat, already planning how they will recount this brave little excursion to their friends. Meanwhile, Old Nichol Street remains exactly as it was before they arrived, except perhaps a little more aware of how invisible its realities become once the wealthy wander off to places where hardship can be discussed, but not felt. You keep walking, realizing that the harshest judgment here does not come from within the slum, but from those who visit only long enough to feel fortunate. You feel it before you fully understand it, a kind of steady hum beneath the grime and noise of Old Nichol Street. It rises from conversations at doorsteps and from laughter shared over meager meals. It shows itself in the way people square their shoulders when outsiders wander through with wide eyes and judgment already forming. The spirit of defiance here is not loud or dramatic. It is woven into daily life, subtle as breath yet strong enough to brace an entire community. You notice it first in a woman scrubbing her doorstep with a rag that has seen better decades. A pair of well-dressed visitors walking past whisper about how pointless it is to clean something destined to be dirty again. Within minutes, the woman hears them, straightens up, and keeps scrubbing with even more determination. She does not argue or defend her work. She simply refuses to let anyone else decide what care looks like in a place that outsiders dismiss before they even step inside. A group of boys playing kickstone in the street break off their game to watch another cluster of visitors wander by. One boy mutters something about people who think their shoes might catch poverty if they stand still too long. The others snicker, not cruelly but knowingly, and when one of the visitors glances their way, they launch back into their game with even more energy, sending the stones skittering across the cobbles like a small act of rebellion. Their play becomes a statement, a reminder that joy can exist even where the world expects only sorrow. Farther along, you pass a tailor working in a doorway, stitching a patch onto a coat with quick, practiced movements. A pair of strangers stop to watch, commenting on how surprising it is that anyone here has a trade. The tailor continues working, unfazed, and tells them that skill does not vanish simply because the walls are crooked. His tone is calm, but his eyes carry a spark that says he knows exactly how little the world expects from this street and how often he proves those expectations wrong. You see it again when a landlord arrives to inspect one of the houses. He lifts a doorframe with his cane and shakes his head dramatically, declaring that the residents should be grateful he provides shelter at all. The family inside stands in a tight group, arms crossed, their expressions a polite version of resistance. They point out the leaks he has ignored, the broken window he has never replaced, the rent he has raised twice despite promising not to. They do not yell. They do not plead. They simply hold their ground with a confidence that catches even him off guard. When he leaves, muttering excuses, the family exchanges satisfied looks as though they have won a small but meaningful battle. In an alley lit by a single dim lantern, you watch a group of neighbors share a meal. The food is simple, but the conversation flows easily, the jokes sharp enough to slice through the thickest gloom. They talk about the outsiders who came earlier, the ones who whispered and stared, and they laugh at the assumptions made by people who see only misery when they visit. One woman lifts her bowl and declares that pity is the most useless ingredient anyone has ever brought to Old Nichol Street. The others nod, raising their bowls as if in agreement. As you walk on, you realize the defiance here is not born of hatred or bitterness. It comes from survival, from pride, from a refusal to let the world reduce this place to a single story. Every gesture, every shared joke, every stubborn act of care pushes back against the narrow image imposed by those who visit only to gape. You feel that hum again, steady and grounded, rising from the very stones beneath your feet. It is the sound of people claiming their own identity, piece by piece, in a place where the outside world insists on writing the ending for them. They refuse that ending entirely. You notice it almost by accident, because kindness in Old Nichol Street rarely announces itself with fanfare. It slips through the alleys quietly, moving with the same caution as everything else in the slum. You are walking behind a woman carrying a pot wrapped in old cloth, steam escaping in thin ribbons. Her steps are quick but steady, her face set with purpose. At first you assume she is simply hurrying home to feed her family, but when she turns into a narrow passage you have not explored, curiosity pulls you along. She stops at a crooked doorway and knocks twice, soft enough not to draw attention, firm enough to be recognized. A moment later, the door opens to reveal an older man hunched over a cane. His face looks like it has been carved from worry, every line a story of winters survived and meals missed. The woman greets him as though this visit is a normal part of her day, and she hands him the pot with a warmth that has nothing to do with the steam rising from it. He tries to protest, insisting that she needs it more, but she waves him off with a practiced scold, saying she made extra on purpose. You doubt that she ever makes extra by accident. Inside his home, you catch glimpses of a room stripped down to its bare bones. A thin blanket folded on a cot, a single candle flickering on a crate pretending to be a table. You realize how easily someone could live here unnoticed, how quickly a person could fade into the cracks of this place if neighbors did not keep an eye out for one another. The man thanks her in a voice that trembles more from emotion than age, and the woman pats his arm before turning to leave. She passes you without acknowledging your presence, her expression already shifting to the next task waiting for her. Later, you see the same woman again, this time crouched next to a child trying to fix a toy that looks far beyond repair. She examines the splintered wood and frayed string, and instead of declaring it hopeless, she tells the child she knows someone who can mend almost anything. The promise is modest, but the child's face brightens as though she has offered a treasure. You follow her with your eyes as she moves through the slum, noticing how people greet her with nods and small smiles. It becomes clear she is one of those quiet pillars, holding up pieces of a world that would otherwise collapse. She does not carry wealth or influence. She carries familiarity, reliability, the kind of presence that steadies everyone else simply by existing. Later in the evening, you sit near a group sharing scraps of bread around a small fire. Someone mentions the woman with the pot, and the others nod knowingly. They talk about how she visits the sick, checks on widows, watches children when parents are stuck in long shifts. No one describes her with reverence or grandeur. They speak of her the way you might speak of running water or a sturdy wall, something essential but easy to take for granted. You sense that this is what kindness looks like here, stitched into the hours instead of performed for applause. You think back to the man accepting the pot of food, his gratitude lingering in the air. You think of the child clutching a broken toy with new hope, and you understand in a way you did not before that life in Old Nichol Street is not defined only by hardship or hunger. It is shaped just as much by these small moments that float between houses like breath on a cold morning. They do not erase the misery, but they soften it, binding people together in ways the outside world rarely sees. You walk on, realizing that the slum survives not because of what it lacks, but because of what its people give one another when no one else is watching. You sense it the moment you step into the small courtyard, tucked between leaning houses, where two groups of residents stand on opposite sides like rival teams, preparing for a match no one actually scheduled. On one side, older men in caps talk about how things used to be done, their voices coated in the confidence of people who have survived enough to believe their methods are proven. On the other side, younger workers argue that the slum has to change if it wants to survive, though they say this while kicking at the crumbling stones under their feet, which do not seem particularly open to improvement. You drift closer and notice that the argument is not hostile. It is more like a long-standing debate repeated so often that everyone knows their lines. A man in his 60s insists that the old ways kept the community together. He gestures at the alley like he is presenting evidence, ignoring the fact that the alley currently smells like damp boots and boiled cabbage. A young woman responds that tradition does not patch leaking roofs or create jobs, and the older man replies that neither does arguing. Around them, neighbors carry on with chores, glancing over occasionally the way people watch familiar weather patterns. As you wander deeper into the slum, you see these tensions ripple through daily life. A group of older women sit by a window, sewing by hand, because that is how their mothers did it and how their mothers' mothers did it. They speak with pride about the skill involved, the rhythm of the needle, the way the cloth tells you what it needs if you listen carefully. Outside, a young man leans against the wall describing a machine he saw at a factory that can finish the same work in a fraction of the time. He says the future is coming whether the slum is ready or not, and one of the women mutters that the future can wait its turn like everyone else. At the market stalls, you watch a butcher wrap meat in old newspaper, repeating the same technique he has used for decades, while a younger vendor tries to sell neatly bundled portions tied with string. He announces it makes people feel more respectable when they carry it home. The butcher snorts loudly enough to make a passing dog jump. He says respectability does not matter if the meat is tough, and no fashionable string will make a bad cut tender. You see it again in a cramped living room where a family prepares for a small celebration. The older relatives insist on traditional songs, the kind passed down through so many generations that no one remembers the original words. The younger ones want something livelier, something that feels less like a lullaby. They tease each other, pull faces, argue over instruments, and finally settle on a messy blend of both. The result is surprisingly charming, even if the rhythm wobbles like an unsteady wheel. As night settles, you overhear two neighbors discussing the rising pressure from outside. One mentions officials talking about redevelopment, using words like progress and improvement. The other responds that progress usually means losing what little they have. They both fall quiet at the thought, staring at the slanted houses illuminated by lantern light. The younger neighbor wonders if change might bring something better, and the older one says maybe, but better for whom is always the real question. You keep walking, taking in the contradictions that define Old Nichol Street. People cling to traditions because they offer familiarity in a world that often shifts without warning. Others push for new ways because the old ones have left them cramped, hungry, and exhausted. Neither side is entirely wrong, and neither seems able to imagine a path that does not require sacrificing something precious. By the time you return to the main alley, you understand that the tension is not a battle. It is the sound of a community trying to balance memory with survival, heritage with necessity, pride with practicality. Old Nichol Street is caught between centuries, holding on with one hand and reaching forward with the other, hoping something solid lies within that uncertain space. Winter does not arrive in Old Nichol Street so much as it seeps in, curling around corners and sliding beneath doorways like a thief who already knows the layout by heart. You feel it first in the wind that slaps against your coat with the kind of enthusiasm normally reserved for unwanted relatives. The air grows sharper, biting at your fingers and ears, turning every breath into something thin and brittle. Even the usual smells of the slum seem muted, as if the cold has frozen them mid-air. You notice how quickly the season reshapes daily life. People who once lingered outside now rush from one doorway to another, hunched against the wind, clinging to coats that have survived far too many winters. Children who usually run wild through the alleys now stay close to home, their games shortened by numb hands and noses that turn red almost instantly. A pot of stew simmering over a small fire draws a crowd, not for the food itself, but for the chance to stand in the circle of heat it creates. In one cramped room, a family gathers around a tiny stove that glows weakly, its warmth spread too thin to reach the far corners. The mother adds another piece of coal, watching it catch with the hopeful expression of someone who knows she cannot spare much more. The father rubs his hands together, promising the children that the worst of winter will pass soon, though even he looks uncertain. You feel the heaviness that fills the room, the way cold makes every worry settle deeper into the bones. Outside, you follow a man carrying a bundle of firewood tied together with worn rope. He moves quickly, his breath forming clouds that vanish as soon as they appear. When you ask where he found the wood, he laughs softly and says he has places, none of which he plans to share. In a neighborhood where warmth is a currency, information becomes a treasure. He disappears into his home, leaving behind only footprints that begin to fade as frost creeps over the ground. You walk past a group of women discussing everything winter refuses to forgive. Leaks in the roof, drafts that sneak through walls, blankets so thin they might as well be bedsheets. They speak with the calm frustration of people who have lived this season enough times to know its tricks. Yet they also swap solutions, offering scraps of cloth, extra coats, or advice about how to block a window with newspaper. Their voices are steady, carrying the quiet determination that keeps the slum from collapsing under its own despair. As night settles in, the cold intensifies until it feels like a presence rather than a temperature. Lamps flicker behind frosted glass, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. Every sound becomes sharper. The crunch of boots on ice, the creak of a door resisting the wind, the distant coughing that travels farther in the frozen air. You pull your coat tighter, aware that even the strongest among the residents seem smaller in winter, as if the season chisels away at whatever comfort they manage to build. You pause near a small fire shared by neighbors who are too used to hardship to waste time pretending everything is fine. They pass around a dented kettle filled with something warm enough to steady trembling hands. They talk about winters that were colder, winters that were kinder, winters when they had more or less than they do now. The stories mix together, forming a thread that ties one generation to the next, each winter carving its own mark into memory. You feel winter's weight pressing onto Old Nichol Street, not just in the frost or the wind, but in the way the season exposes every weakness and amplifies every need. It sharpens hunger, it thins patience, it tests spirits. Yet you also see a strange resilience flicker beneath the hardship, as if the cold itself forces people to lean more heavily on one another. Winter in the slum is unforgiving, but it is never faced alone. You begin to notice it in the small, ordinary moments, the ones that slip past you at first because you are too busy sorting through the noise and the smell and the chaos. But then it gathers, piece by piece, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Old Nichol Street, for all its hardship and hunger and cold, stitches itself into a community with a stubbornness that feels almost miraculous. You see it in the early morning when a woman steps outside with a bucket of water and tosses the contents across the cobblestones, clearing a patch where children can play without slipping. She mutters that she will not have anyone breaking bones on her watch, and a neighbor across the way shouts that the children manage to bruise themselves perfectly well without icy pavement. The two exchange insults softened by laughter, the kind of laughter shared by people who have known each other long enough to skip formalities. When you turn down the next alley, a man leans out of a stem window and hands a loaf of bread to the family below. He explains that the bakery threw out a batch earlier and he rescued what he could. The family accepts it with the casual gratitude of people for whom sharing is second nature, not an event worth announcing. They offer him a bowl of stew in return, and the exchange is so fluid, so practiced, that you realize it must happen in some form every day. A little farther on, you spot a girl helping an elderly neighbor walk to the shared fire at the center of the courtyard. The old woman complains loudly the entire way, insisting she could have managed on her own if her joints were not plotting against her. The girl rolls her eyes and adjusts her grip on the woman's arm. When they reach the fire, the neighbors already sitting there make room without needing to be asked. Someone passes the girl a cup before handing another to the old woman, as though this ritual has been performed 100 times before and will be performed 100 times again. You stop near a doorway where two men are repairing a sagging beam with materials that look suspiciously like leftovers from other households. They argue over measurements, neither willing to admit the other might be correct, but they work in perfect synchronization. When the beam finally holds, a small cheer rises from the crowd that is quietly gathered, and someone jokes about sending a bill to the landlord. The laughter ripples outward, warming the cold air in a way the weak winter sun cannot. You notice how quickly people respond when trouble brews. A child begins to cry, and within moments, 3 adults emerge from different homes, each assuming the sound belongs to one of their own. They kneel beside the child, offering scraps of cloth, a piece of candy, or a story meant to distract from whatever caused the tears. Once the child is soothed, the adults disperse again, returning to their tasks without waiting for thanks. At night, you watch entire families huddle near fires, not separated by blood or age or background, but bound together by the simple need to keep warm. Stories pass from one group to another, flowing like shared breath in the darkness. Someone sings a tune inherited from grandparents, and someone else adds harmonies that were never taught but learned by osmosis through years of proximity. You sense the truth of it as you walk. This place survives because people here braid their lives together, knotting them tightly enough that even misery has difficulty pulling them apart. They argue, complain, tease, and shout, but beneath every word lies a quiet certainty that they belong to one another in ways the outside world cannot understand. Despite the cold, despite the hunger, despite every force pressing down on these slanted roofs and crooked walls, Old Nichol Street finds a way to become more than a slum. It becomes a community that refuses to fracture. You find yourself walking beside a trio of reformers who enter Old Nichol Street with the confident stride of people who believe understanding can be achieved through observation alone. They carry notebooks clutched to their chests, pencils sharpened to dangerous points, and expressions arranged somewhere between concern and academic excitement. One of them announces that they are here to document conditions, as though the slum has been waiting patiently for someone to label its misery in neat handwriting. They begin their tour by examining a row of houses that lean so dramatically they look like they fell asleep against each other. The reformers scribble furiously. One murmurs about structural instability. Another notes inadequate ventilation. The third remarks that the damp is likely responsible for the persistent cough heard across the slum. A resident lounging on a doorstep listens with raised eyebrows and then remarks that they could have saved time by asking anyone who lives there. The reformers smile politely and continue writing as if first-hand knowledge might contaminate their pure, unfiltered theories. Farther down the alley, they stop to discuss sanitation. They gesture at puddles, drains, and buckets with professional seriousness, drawing neat diagrams of everything residents learned to navigate long before these visitors learned to tie their laces. A woman hanging laundry overhears them suggest building a public bath, and she snorts loud enough to turn their heads. She tells them that a bath is a fine idea if they plan to supply the water, the fuel, and a miracle large enough to convince landlords to maintain it. One reformer writes bath improvement potential in his notebook with the enthusiasm of someone who has never argued with a landlord in his life. When children race past, weaving through the reformer's legs with expert agility, the visitors cringe as though chaos itself has touched them. They comment on the dangers of unsupervised play and begin designing hypothetical playgrounds in the margins of their notes. Meanwhile, an older boy guides the younger ones around obstacles, keeping them safe with more awareness than any tidy diagram could capture. The reformers miss this completely, too focused on theorizing to notice the lived systems already in motion. The group pauses at a small gathering where neighbors share tea brewed from leaves steeped far beyond their prime. One reformer remarks on the lack of nutritious options, listing possible dietary interventions. The residents listen politely until one man asks whether the reformers have ever tried living on factory wages. The reformers exchange uncomfortable glances, then jot down income disparity as though they have just discovered it. The neighbors go back to their tea, unimpressed, but mildly entertained. You watch as the reformers debate housing solutions, suggesting wide streets and uniform buildings. They imagine clean lines, fresh plaster, orderly courtyards, all designed to improve life. What they fail to see is how much of the slum's heartbeat pulses through its closeness, the way neighbors can reach each other in moments of need because walls are thin and alleys are narrow. They see only disorder, not the quiet acts of care woven through it. As the tour continues, the reformers become increasingly inspired by their own ideas. They speak in confident phrases about upliftment, transformation, and social progress. They talk over the voices of residents trying to explain what they actually need: warmth, fair wages, honest landlords, clean water that does not vanish each time the pipes groan. The reformers nod thoughtfully, but do not adjust their notes. By the time they prepare to leave, their notebooks bulge with sketches and theories that seem to float above the reality beneath their feet. They walk out satisfied, eager to present solutions crafted from observation but not from understanding. You remain behind, watching the residents return to their routines. Children chase one another. A woman stirs a pot over a fire. Neighbors chat across windows. Life continues, imperfect but rooted in bonds the reformers never truly saw. You realize that the heart of Old Nichol Street is not something you can record in a notebook. It is something you have to live beside long enough to feel. You hear the word demolition whispered long before anyone says it aloud with confidence. It drifts through doorways and across courtyards, floating alongside the smoke from cooking fires. At first, it sounds like another rumor born of winter misery, one of those ideas that warms people briefly before fading away. But then you start hearing it from people who never bother with gossip, people who speak slowly and think before they open their mouths. That is when you realize something is shifting beneath the uneven stones of Old Nichol Street. The first time you see the officials touring the slum with purposeful strides, you understand the seriousness of it. They walk with clipboards tucked under their arms, pointing at roofs, walls, and puddles, as though identifying evidence in a case already decided. One of them shakes his head at the houses leaning against one another like weary drunks, and he writes something with the satisfaction of a man confirming a conclusion he arrived at before stepping foot inside the neighborhood. Residents watch from doorways, arms crossed, expressions guarded. They recognize the look of people evaluating property, not people evaluating lives. Debate spreads quickly. Some neighbors gather in small groups to argue about the future. A few admit that the idea of cleaner streets, solid walls, and steady heating sounds tempting, especially on days when the cold settles into their bones. They talk about children growing up in a safer environment, about rooms that do not leak or sag, but their voices waver when they ask the question, hanging silently over all of them. Where would they go? And would anyone bother to bring them back once the dust settles? Others respond with fierce certainty. They say the slum may be crumbling, but it is theirs. They remind anyone who will listen that community cannot be rebuilt on blueprints. You cannot replicate decades of shared meals, borrowed coal, and neighbors who know exactly when to knock on your door. One man shouts that tearing down the slum is easy, but tearing down the consequences never is. His words spark murmurs of agreement, the kind of low rumble that feels like the beginning of resistance. Reformers return with polished optimism, explaining that replacement housing will be modern and efficient. They describe neat rows of identical buildings with wide streets and bright windows. A woman nearby asks whether these new homes will have rents people can afford. The reformers falter, exchanging glances before offering vague assurances. Their hesitation travels through the crowd like a cold breeze, and someone mutters that promises are cheaper than bricks. You walk beside residents as they discuss what demolition truly means. An older woman says losing the slum is losing the only place that has ever known her. A young father worries about moving somewhere far from the factory, where wages will disappear into transport costs. A widow sits quietly, staring at the houses that hold memories like pressed flowers, fragile but precious. She finally speaks, saying that a place can be broken and beloved at the same time. As tension rises, you notice the slum itself reacting, as though aware of the threat hovering above it. Families reinforce walls with mismatched boards. Neighbors help patch roofs. Children sweep alleys with brooms twice their size. These small acts feel less like repairs and more like declarations. The slum refuses to look abandoned while people still live inside it. Late one evening, you join a gathering around a shared fire. Conversations tumble over one another. Some argue passionately for change, insisting that survival should not feel like punishment. Others say no. The amount of modern convenience is worth losing the closeness that makes Old Nichol Street a place rather than a problem. No one reaches agreement, but everyone cares deeply enough to stay until the fire dies down. As you listen, you realize the debate is not really about buildings or streets. It is about identity, belonging, and the fear of becoming invisible once the walls come down. The slum may be worn and crooked, but it holds lives shaped by endurance and connection. Replacing it is not as simple as clearing ground. The people know that. The planners do not. You feel the shift in the air before anyone speaks it aloud, a heaviness settling over Old Nichol Street like another layer of winter. The threat of displacement hangs everywhere, woven into conversations at doorsteps and murmurs exchanged over shared fires. People walk with a tension that sits just beneath the surface, the kind that makes every sound sharper and every silence louder. It is not fear exactly. It is something deeper, a kind of dread that grows when you realize the ground beneath you is no longer promised. You see it clearly in a woman standing outside her doorway, arms folded tightly as she listens to a neighbor read a notice posted by officials. The paper flaps in the wind, crisp and official, painfully clean against the worn wood. It speaks of redevelopment and improvement, words that look harmless enough but hit with the force of eviction. The woman stiffens as though bracing herself against an invisible blow. This doorway is not just a place to step through. It is where she raised children, where she has watched seasons change, where her life has unfolded inch by inch. Just down the alley, a young father gathers his children close while explaining that they may have to move. His voice tries to sound steady, but the children sense what he does not say. They ask if their friends will come with them, if the new place will smell the same, if there will be room to play. He promises what he can, but even his eyes wander to the uneven walls around them, as if memorizing details he once took for granted. You realize that the slum may be crumbling, but it holds something the newer, cleaner streets never will. History, familiarity, a heartbeat that syncs with the people who live in it. You pass a group of older residents huddled near a stove, each of them speaking with a mixture of anger and sorrow. They traded stories here for decades, through weddings, deaths, celebrations, and losses. Now they wonder aloud where they will go when the bulldozers arrive. One man insists he will chain himself to his doorstep if they try to force him out. The others laugh, but the laughter feels thin, stretched over too much uncertainty. They all know he means it more than he wants to admit. At the market, vendors discuss rumors with the intensity of strategists planning for war. Some argue that leaving might offer a chance at a better life. Others say better for whom, and who gets to decide what better even means. The conversations swell with frustration, hope, disbelief, and grief, all tangled together like old rope fraying at the ends. And beneath every debate lies the same truth. The slum may be rough and worn, but it is theirs. It is the only world many have ever known. As you move through the alleys, you notice people lingering outside their homes longer than usual, as if trying to absorb every detail. A woman touches the brickwork of her wall with a hand that trembles. A boy runs his fingers across the carved initials on a wooden beam left behind by someone who moved away years ago. A man looks up at the cracked window in his room, the one he always meant to fix, and smiles with the kind of affection that surprises even him. The slum's flaws have become part of their stories, stitched into their lives in ways that cannot simply be moved to another address. Night falls, and you find yourself sitting near a group gathered around a weak fire. No one pretends things are fine. They speak with a raw honesty that comes only when uncertainty pushes people to the edge of vulnerability. They talk about where they might go, what they might lose, and what pieces of their lives they fear will not follow them. They argue, comfort one another, and fall into stretches of silence where the crackling of the fire fills the spaces between thoughts. In that moment, you understand fully what is at stake. This place may be battered and overlooked, but it has shaped every person who calls it home. Displacement is not just losing walls and floors. It is losing memory, routine, identity. It is stepping into a world where the echoes of their lives no longer follow them. And even the strongest among them are not ready to let those echoes fade. You wake to the sound of hammers striking wood, a rhythm that feels wrong in the air, too purposeful and clean for a place that has always grown and broken in its own uneven way. When you step outside, you see workers in heavy coats moving through the slum with an efficiency that makes the alleys feel smaller. They carry tools that gleam in the weak light, tools meant for taking apart rather than putting together. For a moment you stand still, trying to understand what looks familiar and what has already changed, and then you notice it. A house at the corner is missing its roof. Residents gather in clusters, watching with expressions that shift between disbelief and stubborn detachment. A woman who once scrubbed her doorstep every morning now stands motionless beside it, as though waiting for someone to tell her the work crews have made a mistake. The doorway is still hers. The cracks in the wall still belong to her. But the building next to it has already been stripped down to bare beams, its insides exposed to the cold. She reaches out and touches the wood of her own doorframe, as if reassuring herself it has not vanished yet. Along the alley, children wander in slow circles, unsure whether play is allowed. On a day like this, a boy stands in front of the remains of his neighbor's home, staring at the pile of bricks with wide, bewildered eyes. He asks an older girl where the family will sleep tonight, and she answers with a quiet honesty that says she has no idea. The boy nods, accepting this answer not because it comforts him, but because it is the only one he is given. You walk toward the center of the slum, where people have gathered around a building half drowned in dust. Men and women stand shoulder to shoulder, arguing with the foreman who holds a rolled document like a shield. They demand time, explanations, mercy. He offers none of these, only instructions and deadlines spoken in a voice that has practiced detachment. The residents shout louder, but even their anger carries a thread of exhaustion. They have fought for years, and they know this is the final round, whether they win it or not. Inside a house about to be cleared, an elderly man sits on a stool, holding a chipped mug he refuses to pack away. He tells you he drank his morning tea from this very spot for more seasons than he can count. The walls around him are stripped bare, revealing old plaster patched so many times it looks like a map of forgotten roads. He says the house creaks differently in winter and that you can tell who is approaching by the sound of their footsteps on the warped floorboards. Soon none of that will matter, but he says it anyway, passing the memories into the air like something worth keeping, even if nothing else can be saved. You step outside and see gaps forming where homes once stood, empty spaces swallowing the shape of the neighborhood. The alleys that once twisted confidently now lead nowhere, ending abruptly in piles of rubble. Smoke from cooking fires rises beside dust from the demolition, blending into a haze that makes the slum seem both present and already fading. Someone nearby mutters that the streets look naked, stripped of the clutter that gave them character, and the remark lands with an ache no one tries to hide. Neighbors gather belongings with hurried, unpracticed hands. A woman clutches a bundle of blankets. Another carries a pot blackened from years of use. A man loads a few tools onto a cart he built himself, glancing back at his collapsing home as though expecting it to call him back. People speak softly, as if raising their voices might hasten the dismantling. By late afternoon, shadows fall across walls that will not see another sunrise. You walk through the slum one last time, hearing echoes instead of voices, seeing outlines where families once stood. The buildings shrink, the alleys widen, and the heart of old Nichol Street beats in fewer and fewer places. You realize that what is being destroyed is not just wood or brick. It is the stories tucked into door frames, the jokes traded across windows, the footsteps worn into stone. Memories cling stubbornly to the ruins, but even they cannot hold back what comes next. Old Nichol Street is disappearing, and the empty spaces feel louder than any demolition crew. You step through the broken edge of Old Nichol Street, as if crossing a boundary you were never meant to see from either side. Behind you, the slum lies in a strange half-life, some houses gutted to their skeletons, others leaning stubbornly as though trying to make the demolition crews feel guilty. Dust drifts in the air like a slow-falling snow, settling in your hair and clothes until you smell faintly of lime and memory. You look back one last time, expecting to feel distance settle in, but the place clings to you in a way no intact neighborhood ever could. You walk carefully around a pile of shattered bricks that once formed a corner shop whose stale bread somehow tasted better than it should have. The woman who ran it stands nearby, clutching the small tin where she kept her carefully counted coins. She meets your eyes for a moment, and in that brief exchange, you feel the quiet ache of someone losing not just a building but the shape of her days. She gives a small nod, something between farewell and acknowledgement, before turning toward the road with a determination that surprises you. As you continue on, a group of children weave past you, kicking a dented tin can with the same enthusiasm they showed when the alleyways were still intact. Their laughter rises into the cold air, light and bright, cutting through the gloom with a sound that feels almost defiant. You watch them race toward a stretch of street that no longer leads home, yet they run it anyway, because running is what they know, and childhood insists on existing even when nothing else does. Further along, you pass the elderly man with the chipped mug, now holding it like a relic rather than a possession. He sits on a low wall at the edge of the cleared area, staring at the space where his home once stood. He talks softly to a man beside him, describing the way the light used to fall through his window in the early mornings. The other man listens with the patience of someone who understands that the past has become a kind of shelter, even if the physical world can no longer provide one. You do not interrupt them. Some conversations deserve the quiet around them. When you reach the final bend, the slum feels like a distant echo, despite being only steps away. The noises that once defined it, the calls of vendors, the clatter of pans, the hum of voices leaking from windows, have faded into muffled hints carried by the wind. The stillness feels wrong, as though the place is holding its breath while waiting to become something else entirely. You feel the urge to go back, to catch one more glimpse, but you know it would look just as it did a moment ago, and just as it will look a little less whole with each passing hour. You step into the broader street beyond the slum, where London continues about its business with the same impatient energy it always has. People pass without noticing the dust on your clothes or the heaviness in your steps. A horse cart rattles by, the driver humming a cheerful tune that has nothing to do with loss or endings. For a moment you feel strangely out of place, caught between the world that remains standing and the one that has been dismantled behind you. As you move farther away, you begin to realize that you are carrying something with you that cannot be shaken off. It settles in your chest, woven from images of narrow alleys, stubborn doorways, and the people who filled them with a heartbeat no amount of poverty could erase. You understand now that old Nichol Street was never just the grime or the crowding or the decay. It was the laughter squeezed between hardships, the fierce loyalty that held neighbors together, the way life insisted on continuing even when every condition argued against it. You turn a final corner, and the slum disappears from sight. But the stories remain, steady and insistent, refusing to fade simply because the buildings have fallen. You walk on, carrying them with you, knowing they will shape the way you see every street from this point forward.